that's when you can start.
I think we don't want the gallery at the beginning.
Do you want to share a different thing?
Well, I think I'm going to be on, and then I'm going to introduce people, and then they're going to introduce themselves. So right now for the intro, I'm going to be on, I think. I thought that's what we said.
Oh, yeah, Bonnie, it just means that the other participants, we're just on the side. We're not highlighted like you will be because you'll be speaking.
Okay.
It should be okay.
Okay. Well, good luck, everybody. Break away. I don't see my, you don't see the clock on this image anymore.
Sorry.
You could start my video. What does that mean?
Yes, I accidentally turned it off. I'm sorry. That's my bad.
What am I supposed to do? It's in my face.
Do you see?
What do I hit later?
What button options do you have?
Later or start my video?
Start your video.
What's my video?
There we go. All good. That was my mistake.
$329. Ian, are we on?
Yep, go right ahead.
Hello, everybody. Good evening, good afternoon. We're very happy to be here. We're excited to be here with a fabulous panel of distinguished people who will be presenting a lot of their wonderful ideas. And we are very interested in the subject of managed retreat. However, our idea is that we're redefining it. We're looking at it from a very holistic perspective, from an ecological natural systems perspective. And we see a lot of opportunities that I don't feel have yet been discussed. I may have missed something in these presentations. So we're public discourse and media attention regarding climate change and coastal communities typically focuses on the dangers of sea level rise, extreme weather events, flooding, crumbling shorelines and buildings. The reaction often has been limited to consider either constructing physical barriers to protect land and residential assets or retreating to upland areas. But those solutions are challenging, expensive, disruptive, and not necessarily effective, as they offer a fragmented approach that misses many important issues. What has been less discussed is how to reimagine, reinvent, and reestablish the concept of retreat in terms of multi-layered, integrated, ecological transformation, so as to allow a stronger compatibility between human occupancy, the quality of life, and social issues, optimum land use, and nature's best response to climate change. We propose the term managed retreat should not just focus on mass human movement away from threatened coastlines, but instead focus on the transformation of the whole watershed, its management, enjoyment for all species, incorporating more ecological and nature-based design, upstream midstream, downstream. And that allows society to retreat in a much more interesting ecological way from urbanized gray infrastructure and manage scientifically thoughtful and creative processes that also promote compelling visions that realize practical, holistic, blue-green infrastructure opportunities with regard to the ecological improvement, disruption, and cost effectiveness, while improving environmental social conditions gradually, including addressing issues of race and equity, while educating a broad community about all processes, systems, and outcomes. Our panel will discuss and showcase examples of the systemic and relational thinking and doing using geographic and social considerations from California, but also in Asia, but also a global perspective with experience from planning, landscape architecture, arts, community, school, education, environmental justice, science, political, policy background, and watershed expertise. Our distinguished panel includes Congressman Jared Huffman, who I'll be introducing more fully later, and Scott Warner, Carl Anthony, John Englander, Betsy Damon, and myself. And each of us will give a little synopsis of what we do. But in order to set the stage, I'm going to share my screen and show you a few images. That really kind of lets us know some opportunities. Functional art is a term that I invented. Functional. And it's really a new planetary genre of art, which I feel is incredibly important, in which East marries West, North and South. The so-called functionalism of the West, which is integrated, interlinked with the spiritualism, alignment, and feng shui of Eastern, Northern, and Southern cultures, plus indigenous cultures worldwide. We need a planetary look at various styles and methodologies. And again, when we think of art in these ways, not just as something that you hang on the wall, but as a system of ecological systems, it really is the most powerful methodology available for humans to create positive change, especially when art incorporates nature as a model. So that kind of sets the tone. Now, I'm going to ask each of our panelists to give a 1 minute, to begin with, just a 1 minute description of themselves. So, Carl, would you do that? Can you unmute your computer?
Oh, yes. My name is Carl Anthony. I'm founder of Breakthrough Communities. I've been at this a long time. I was educated as an architect at Columbia University, and I went to UC Berkeley, and where I've been teaching architecture for since 1973. I left the University of Columbia at Berkeley and have been engaged in the environmental movement for the last 35 or 40 years. I was president of Earth Island Institute, and I also was a leader in the urban habitat program, where we directed much of the attention of the environmental movement on the issues of communities of color and environmental justice. I've been at the Ford Foundation. I was a funder of some 60 grants that really focused on education of communities of color and I've been active in various things ever since then.
Thank you. Okay, Scott, how about giving us a 1-minute elevator speech?
Sure. Thanks, Bonnie, and hello to everybody out there. I'm Scott Warner, principal hydrogeologist with consulting firm BBJ, but also a doctoral researcher with the University of Newcastle in Australia. And the background is Newcastle. I'm not there right now. I'm in Northern California. It's about 9:30 in the morning tomorrow in Newcastle. And I've been working in the area of hydrogeology, water resources, watershed management for some 30 years now. And a lot of my focus really goes into the effect and the impact of climatic influence on our watershed, and looking at not just small focused areas, but actually the holistic aspect of the watershed. So where I plan to discuss today is actually bringing ourselves into understanding the entirety of the system. If you think of the hydrologic cycle, for example, it's all water is recycled, and it has been millions of times. And the idea of being able to combine that ecological with the scientific and the cultural is important. But I also want to make apparent, and I'll talk about this a little bit, in that when we talk about a managed retreat, that it's not just, as Bonnie mentioned, people retreating. It's the aspect of trying to understand, what are we leaving behind? Can we leave things behind that where we've already been? Or do we actually deserve to manage and understand those aspects as well on the shoreline as well as in the watershed?
Thank you. Okay, John.
I'm John Englander. I'm an oceanographer. I've written a couple of books about sea level rise specifically, and got to meet Scott and some of you in the Bay Area when I gave some talks out there over the last several years. I live in Florida, of course, perceived as an epicenter for potential flooding, but I get to give briefings to engineers and architects and military leaders and even intelligence agencies all over the world, because I kind of integrate the big picture of sea level rise from a geologic standpoint and the ice sheets, Greenland and Antarctica, where I take regular fact-finding expeditions or groups. So I'm glad to give that perspective to this panel about managed retreat and the watershed.
Okay, thank you, John. I'm looking forward to hearing your presentation. Representative Jared Huffman, unfortunately, was called away at the last minute. He represents California's 2nd Congressional District, which spans the north coast of the state from the Golden Gate Bridge to the Oregon border, and includes Marin, Sonoma, Mendocino, Humboldt, Trinity, and Del Norte counties. He was first elected to Congress in November 2012 and currently serves on the Committee on Natural Resources, the Committee on Transportation and Infrastructure, and the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. And we're going to hear more from Congressman Huffman shortly. Now, another person who is on our panel is actually en route from Paris to San Francisco as we speak. So she was not able to join us. Sophie Maxwell is the president of the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission. She served 3 terms on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, representing San Francisco's District 10, which includes Potrero Hill, Bayview, Hunters Point, Visitation Valley, Silver Terrace, Dog Patch, Little Hollywood, and the Portola districts. And again, we'll hear a little bit more about her later. And another person on our panel, Betsy Damon, will be joining us hopefully in a short while. She had some conflicts at this particular moment in time. She's in New York. She's an internationally known ecological artist, and she is the founder of Keepers of the Water, and she works with water and the importance of water, and has done work all over the world. Okay, so now let's go back, Carl, you want to give a little bit more of a description of your work?
Yeah, I would say that much of my work has been focused on the people of color and who are in many sections of the United States are now in the majority. 63% of California are represent communities of color, and the work that we've done really has helped us to understand that even as we talk about the reality of the people and nature, that we have not given sufficient attention to the realities of people of color and the ways that the environment affects people of color who've often overlooked by the so-called mainstream. They say it's the mainstream, but the majority of people in the world are people of color, and we're struggling with those issues.
Carl, do you want to show your presentation now?
Sure.
Let's do that. So you have to share your screen.
So the first image I'm showing now is a representation of our book, Breakthrough Communities, Sustainability and Justice in the Next American Metropolis. The second slide is actually an image of that publication. That publication really grew out of my work at the Ford Foundation. We gave some 63 grants that totaled almost $40 million to community-based organizations who had been engaged in working for community development in their neighborhoods and had been funded to work on those things, but had not had an opportunity to really explore some of the environmental issues that had a profound impact on them. So we, as I said, we gave out 63 grants, and we published a book called Breakthrough Communities, Sustainability and Justice in the Next American Metropolis. And which featured some 12 of those communities across the United States. And the basic point of those communities was really that there's a wide diversity of experience and challenges that are faced by communities of color. And some of these grants that we gave out provided a kind of a context for us to really explore some of those issues. There was a great deal of participation that made that possible.
Next book. Next slide, your book, Earth City.
Okay. The next slide is called The Earth, the City, and the Hidden Narrative of Race. And this book actually is, at one level, is really a memoir of my own experience coming through various institutions of education and also teaching at those education and some of my professional experience. One of the main things that really grew out of those experiences was a recognition that in facing the environmental issues that communities have had to face, that we have not necessarily been able to give the attention to the environment that is a high priority for our communities as well as other communities. We worked with the California Institute addressing environmental literacy for the state of California, and we have been really focused on the educational requirements of our neighborhoods and communities. And while we have been able to accomplish a great deal, we have not yet been able to focus on the environmental issues that are facing our communities, which are now coming to the fore as a high level of attention. The fourth The third picture is climate justice, and we worked on air quality and the transportation system in in the Bay Area, some 98 jurisdictions, and $240 billion for the transportation system in that area, and came up with recommendations that actually influenced the development of the perspective of the Metropolitan Transportation Commission. The work that was done by neighborhood groups actually outperformed the other special studies in terms of reduction of air quality and the touching of important manifestations in those neighborhoods. I want to make the really most important point here in this presentation today, that we can focus a great deal of our attention on the impact on real estate of sea level rise, but we really need to put the emphasis on the building of neighborhoods and cultures that make it possible for our communities to really survive and thrive in the development of sustainability over the future generations. So that while we have numbers that really represent the impact of sea level rise on real estate, we're not as skillful at really paying attention to the impact of these neighborhoods and communities, the environment on these neighborhoods and communities. We came to the conclusion a long time ago that if you're not on the menu, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu, and you have to be really skillful at bringing our neighborhoods into the heart of the discussion about sea level rise. I would say that this is perhaps the one thing that is missing to many evaluations of sea level rise, that the people of color are actually among the most disadvantaged in our communities. And as I mentioned, in California, which has a very great performance in terms of sea level rise and in terms of environmental issues, 63% of the population in California are people of color, and are not necessarily as recognized as participants in addressing the issues of people of environmental issues. I'd also want to say that many of our neighborhoods are facing a scale of addressing these neighborhoods and communities that really put them at the center of the potential threats of sea level rise and the consequences of both public policy as well as environmental implication of those neighborhoods and communities. Another really important aspect of our addressing the issues of communities of color is I'm sorry.
This slide says nothing about us without us.
There you go. Nothing about us without us. You see what happens when you get to be silent. Nothing about us without us. And one of the things that we really have emphasized in the social movement that we've been part of the leadership of across the country is the idea that we speak for ourselves, that we need to have the issues that we have been addressing in our neighborhoods and in our communities at the center of our conversation about the consequences of potential sea level rise, and a retreat from the idea that we would be expanding into the sea. So we have to retreat to new communities and new situations where our communities can flourish.
Tend and befriend.
One really interesting issue, which I'm going to ask Richard Page to talk about, is a kind of an emerging new philosophy about our response to sea level rise in the publication of UCLA. Do you want to talk about that for a minute, Richard?
Sure. Thanks, Carl. Carl helped us discover Dr. Shelley Taylor's work using oxytocin research. The original fight or flight response to stress research was done on men only in the 1930s. And that's what we believed were the only responses. But Dr. Shelley Taylor researched women and find that in stress, women move to tend and nurture the young and befriend the community. And we can apply that here to nature. If we tend and befriend, we have a whole different paradigm than pushing against or running from. And that brings us to Carl's beloved community, how to form it.
I'd like to say that the idea of the beloved community achieved a great deal of emphasis from Dr. Martin Luther King and his colleagues in the American South and then all over the country in the civil rights movement. That we are committed to really building a beloved community of all of the human race in responding to the challenges of our natural environment, and then also acknowledging that the animals and the plants and the trees are all really an essential part of the obligation that we all have to create a world that in which the sea can grow and thrive, but also the people on the planet in the United States and in the rest of the world have a space that is required in order for them to survive. And the idea of a beloved community is that we have to find a way to do this that really shows our passion for the other species as well as the human species that makes that possible. So I think that's the end of my presentation.
Okay, Carl, that was fantastic. I want to mention that Carl was cited in the plenary opening by Jackie, whose last name I don't know, but she's in charge of the NAACP climate justice, and she cited Carl as being one of the leaders in this movement, which he is, and so we're very grateful that he's participating with us today because he reminds us of many things that are so important. Okay, Ian, I'd like you to play Congressman Jared Huffman's video now. Can you do that?
Hi, everyone. I'm Congressman Jared Huffman, and for those who don't know me, I represent California's 2nd Congressional District, which starts at the Golden Gate Bridge, which is pictured just behind me in my office here, and goes all the way up the coast to the Oregon border. I chair the Natural Resources Subcommittee on Water, Oceans, and Wildlife. I also serve on the House Select Committee on the Climate Crisis and the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee. So these are places where I get to do a lot of work on environmental and climate policy. I also spend a lot of time focusing on how climate change is impacting our water resources and communities that depend on them. So as someone who has a massive swath of coastline, about a third of the California coast, including some of the most scenic coastal areas in America, I also center a lot of my work around ensuring that coasts and oceans and working waterfronts are managed better to address the climate change-driven threats that we're up against. Sea level rise is obviously one of the many impacts of climate change that we're already seeing. It's already happening. coastal communities in my district and throughout the country are experiencing dangerous flooding, storm surges, and the damage, the toll on coastal infrastructure and homes is growing every year. We're even starting to see sunny day flooding with high tides in some places. Come to Sausalito in my district, or to Miami, Florida, or soon to New York City. This isn't just a one-dimensional threat. These impacts pose risks for all sectors, including agriculture, fisheries, and any type of industry you can think of. It's also going to have disproportionate impacts on underserved communities who have the least capacity to adapt. The concept of managed retreat in some places is inevitable, but there are also some risk-informed adaptation and resilience strategies that can help us make better planning decisions to increase coastal resilience, including where to build and how to build or rebuild higher. Risk-informed adaptation and resilience can also inform where we prioritize natural climate solutions, like blue carbon ecosystems, which absorb floodwaters. They can buffer against sea level rise and also provide natural carbon sequestration. In fact, just last week, I introduced a bill, my Blue Carbon Protection Act, to help protect and restore blue carbon ecosystems in the United States. And that includes things like mangroves, wetlands that are estuarine or saltwater wetlands, seagrass, kelp forests. These are things that help us store carbon while ensuring healthy ecosystems and resilient coastal communities. And as communities contend with the escalating impacts of climate change, it's becoming increasingly important that we use all available tools. Natural solutions have to be part of that toolbox. And I will just say this about the politics of natural solutions. After talking about my bill in committee, a Republican colleague from a low-lying Gulf Coast state came up to me and was very interested in partnering on this. So it may be that working on these natural solutions and even blue carbon ecosystem protections could be a sweet spot of bipartisan cooperation. Before I close, I want to not only underscore the urgent need for comprehensive climate legislation in Congress, but also share a little bit of hope, because it is a daunting challenge that we are trying to confront. But I do think the 117th Congress is a turning point for climate action. We have a president and a vice president and an administration that really gets it. They understand the urgency and the opportunity in this moment. I know my Democratic colleagues and myself, obviously, in this Congress understand that. We've got a lot of climate champions ready to take action. And best of all, the American people are with us. As Speaker Nancy Pelosi often says, public opinion is everything. With it, there's almost nothing you can't do. Without it, it's very hard to do anything. So this is a moment, and we are trying to walk the walk on this issue. We're working to advance comprehensive climate solutions every chance we get in Congress. Many really important bills have already passed the House, forward-looking, bold actions to confront the climate crisis, including a climate-focused infrastructure package that's shaping up right now in the House. And this responds to the investment priorities outlined in President Biden's American Jobs Plan. This plan includes everything from cleaning up our transportation and electricity sectors to building climate resilient infrastructure and communities to investing in clean water infrastructure. We need to act now to deliver for the American people and future generations, because this crisis obviously is not waiting. We're running out of time, and this is a moment that we have to seize. So I'm going to close with one last thought. A couple of weeks ago, for a fleeting moment, about 6 minutes, the entire California economy, the fifth largest economy in the world, was powered by more than 90% renewable energy. This is something that even just a few years ago, experts and grid operators and others told us you can't do. You can't even come close to doing. And yet we're doing it. And we're going to see more of those days in the months and years ahead. This is something that is referred to as the Overton window, when something is presumed to be impossible, but eventually becomes inevitable. So this Overton window is changing in the direction of climate action and is rewarding climate leadership in California and many other places. I think there's reason for hope, as daunting as this challenge can often seem. So thank you for inviting me to be part of this important conversation. Stay well, and I wish you lots of success with your conference.
Thank you. That was a wonderful presentation by Congressman Jared Huffman, and it makes me feel very hopeful that the administration is moving in this direction. I'd like us to move now to Scott Warner, who really is a scientist about this kind of work, and get his perspectives about these issues. He told us a little bit about his interest in natural systems, whole systems. So take it away, Scott. I also just want to say, Scott and I work very closely together. And when we get to my work, you'll see the kind of thing that we're doing together. Some of it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Bonnie. I appreciate it. Hopefully my screen shows up here well with Yerba Buena Island in the background here. First of all, I want a full acknowledgement. I live in Congressmember Huffman's district here in Northern California, and I've met him several times and have appreciated each time. I also want to say, Carl, Anthony, it's a pleasure to be on this panel with you as well. And I saw a quote that you had mentioned, or you mentioned Chief Queen Quet of the Gullah Geechee community in South Carolina. And for those in the audience here, if you didn't see her remarks the other morning, I would suggest going and find them, because they were outstanding. I am a geologist, hydrogeologist by profession, and I became a geologist really after starting study looking at solar engineering at UCLA many years ago, several decades ago. But then Mount St. Helens erupted in 1980. And I was totally enthralled by that. And I was enthralled by that because of the recognition that the power of the earth is everything. We as humans do not have control over the earth. Sometimes we think we do, but in reality, the earth is smarter than we are, and it'll figure things out. Water will go where it wants to go. The world will continue to evolve. We are just a little speck in time. And so our world, we have to understand it and adapt to it and live with it. And do it in the best way we can. And not saying put up barriers, because quite frankly, those barriers are going to go away. We all know that, right? So that's kind of where I'm coming from in this discussion. And yes, Bonnie, thank you very much. It's always been a pleasure to work with you. And John, it's always been a pleasure to know you and as you bring this area to us. So I'm going to move forward here. I do want to start with acknowledgement of the custodians of our land, where I live here in Northern California, the Coast Miwok, and where I'm continuing to do my studies in the Newcastle area, about 100 miles north of Sydney, and the Awapakal on the Callahan campus at the University of Newcastle. I want to start with this view of the South San Francisco Bay, and all these photographs are mine. You don't want to sit next to me in an airplane, because I'm going to have the window open taking pictures all the time. But I want to kind of go back and look at the entire watershed as we're talking about managed retreat. We're talking about sea level changes. We're talking about the entire watershed, but kind of step back a little bit and look at the larger picture of the watershed, and then bring it back to a few areas that I hope we don't forget about as we go through this process. And I've kind of done this little puzzle with the word retreat as part of our theme of redefining it, where I've brought in a couple of other ideas, some from Bonnie. The word transformational comes from you, because quite frankly, that's what you are pushing. But then these other aspects of restoration and ecology, areal extent, so that our vision is actually broader. And then the tools that we can use today with our own vision, with technology, and with observation of what's around us. And I think one of the things I've maybe understood or appreciate as an earth scientist is that we don't live in a singular dimensional world. It's a multi-dimensional world. And so that vision of being able to understand and perceive and look forward can be supplemented by the technology. And I'll talk about some of the technology today that will help us as we move forward. Okay, in this kind of blocky looking figure, which it looks almost like an engineering diagram with all my arrows and pipes and this and that, is the water cycle. And I bring the water cycle in because, as I mentioned before, all water is recycled. It has been for billions of years, right? But we live in this continual cycle and circulating pattern. If I start up in the upper left-hand corner of the screen with storms coming into the West Coast, wow, wouldn't we love a storm right now with us being in our drought situation again? And then moving through this watershed of rain and snow in the alpine regions to taking different directions into our aquatic area, our fisheries, our desert areas, maybe a terminal area where the water evaporates back into the atmosphere, comes back down, or our engineering systems where we're redistributing water. And then to our agriculture areas, cities, and then eventually the bay, and then out to the ocean again, and then we start the whole cycle again. And I bring this up again because, when we're focused on the shoreline, it's not just the shoreline that we have an influence over, right? It extends back into the watershed, and it's, we all talk about the butterfly effect sometimes, right? The moth swinging itself somewhere in Europe causes the South Pacific hurricane or something like that. Well, maybe not, but the whole point is that in a cycle like this, that what we do in one place does have an influence elsewhere. So I want to bring that forward. And then bring that forward to the issue that we're talking about today in terms of this whole conference and managed retreat. We don't have to bring in, John is going to do he's going to tell us all about the science of sea level rise. I'm here to say that we're within it. And so what does that mean from the standpoint of the things that I am working on specifically? And I'm going to focus in on the contaminant issues along the shore. And I bring that into this discussion because as we're talking about restoring the entire watershed, if we don't then think about where we've been from the standpoint of our impact to the shorelines in both developed areas, in economically underserved areas, in rural areas, in marsh areas, there was a lot of discussion in our conference this week about marshlands, then we're actually missing some of the more important aspects of understanding what retreat means and how we protect that. And I have a picture here from the Sydney Harbor Bridge looking out toward Fort Denison and this catchment, and I starting to bring in the catchment issue because we can map out with our tools those areas that sea level and shoreline issues, how they affect the catchment going upstream. We do the same thing here in the San Francisco Bay Area, where we have a number of different things going on, right? We know about these landfills, for example, on the shoreline of the Bay Area. Many big cities have that, from Baltimore to New York City to Seattle. If we're concerned about this rising sea, well, we have a couple things that we have to deal with as well. One is our legacy along the shoreline, not just community buildup, but also our legacy of development, use, and waste management or waste disposal, which is important. And we can map these areas, and that's what I've kind of done in my central photo here, where I'm looking at potential inundation areas. And within that, we can start identifying how many of these, let's call them priority sites, that we have to deal with. And in the San Francisco Bay Area, there could be 3,000 or more of these sites and impacts where the residual legacy of those, both the same word, the legacy of human occupancy and waste will remain, whether we are there or not. So the question for us is, do we have the tools and do we have the opportunities to look at those and actually do some protection if we can, or rethink our approach to dealing with the view on the right here, taking off out of the Oakland airport. You have this beautiful view up the Berkeley Emeryville shoreline, and each of these are only a few, these yellow triangles of some of these legacy sites. Fortunately, tools are being developed, and the technology is helping us quite a bit in at least starting again to adjust our vision of where are those areas that need most attention. The Adapting to Rising Tides .org site that Alameda County and a number of the jurisdictions within the Greater Bay Area have contributed to is a terrific relational database now where we can start playing with different scenarios of sea level rise, combining with king tides, combining with storm surges, things that John is going to be talking about. But we can start identifying those areas within this that will require our attention. Some of the beauty, I'm actually going to skip forward one thing and I'll come back to that last slide. Some of the beauty of having that is then we have these other tools where we can start also identifying other important information such as economic and other risk data by which to put on top of that and start showing us and focusing us, because we have limited time, we have limited money, we have limited resources, but we can focus on and make decisions on where should we pay our attention to, and that will help. And then I go back to this is one of the problems in terms of the scientific and technical areas about the rising sea on the coast that goes beyond even the movement of community, but it's the ecological aspects. If I've been working in a static world where I'm going to assume that tomorrow is just like today, and next week is just like this week, and next month is just like this month, and on and on and on, then I'm going to miss some of these very important dynamic issues that are happening. As water moves in, water moves up, chemistry changes, biology changes within this ecological system, we may get some changes to our legacy contaminant focused areas, which maybe in the long run, the Earth will take care of itself. But we want to fix things while we're still here. And part of that is making sure that we understand these changes that can occur. Again, I have a contaminant site, I have an urban setting, it could be sewers, could be a wastewater plant, etc. As that water goes up and that water comes in, we're going to have a release of these, potentially of these contaminants, which are going to affect the ecology. And it's not only here at the shore, but it's also upland into those areas where the watershed has been essentially urbaned over, right? As if we don't put this into our vision as well and understand those conditions that we've changed, we're going to have some other issues to talk about. And then finally, kind of another tool that we can use is the vision of where are our wetlands? Where are our streams? Watersheds are not just a single stream. It's this dendritic, multiple arms of all kinds of different drainages in the natural landscape. We have those tools now where we can actually see where these areas are. We can map out and predict these areas. And that, again, as we combine that with the rising sea issue and rising groundwater beneath that, we have better abilities and better techniques and tools to work with. So that's it for me. I just want to kind of loop back in and remember that everything is connected. All water is recycled. The watershed is all encompassing. And whether we're at the high alpine areas or the Golden Gate Bridge, or we're in an area of drought, as in the High Sierra here, it's going to take that holistic, comprehensive vision to help us and put the science with the ecology together. All right. There we go. Thanks, Bonnie.
Thank you. This is a fantastic presentation, and I'm very happy to hear your words, your thoughts, and also very happy that you're on my team and doing work together, because you bring incredible knowledge to the parts of the work that I do, which I'll share with you later. But now let's go to John Englander, who is a very special guest. He's a prolific writer and speaker to thousands of people all over the world. So you have the floor, John. Thank you.
Thanks, Bonnie. It's a pleasure, and it's a nice opportunity to balance the kind of expertise that Scott brings and you bring, and everybody else on this panel, has introduced, because they're so diverse. And of course, when you look at sea level rise in the watershed, it creates that kind of challenge, but opportunity. And Carl, I should have mentioned him for sure. I was reaching for his name. The idea of retreat implies time frame. Are we talking about what we're going to do this year? Are we talking about the next decade, the next 20 or 30 years, generation, this century? And of course, we have to have a challenge or a concept of what's going to happen. How bad will things get? We have to deal with both the near term, the medium term, and the long term. And that kind of frames my thinking. And particularly my new book, which is out moving to higher ground, talks about 3 time frames of, up to 30 years as a home mortgage, gets us out to mid-century. But most infrastructure is planned for 50 to 100 years. And so we've got to do all 3. We've got to deal with the short term of what do we do this year, the next 5 years, this decade as short term actually, then midterm, think of it as mid-century, 30 years from now, and then that longer term, the 50 to 100 years. Because if we don't see where we're going in the long term, we're going to be doing a lot of short-term things which become overwhelmed or outdated or overpowered. To put things in that big perspective, even though it kind of adds to the challenge, but gives us some sense of where is this coming from and where is this going? If we had been born 120,000 years ago, and there were humans or people of our species back then, scientists say, that sea level was 25 feet higher, 7 meters above present, the world would look very, very different. And that was a natural phase of geology. And again, like Scott, I'm a geology major and look at the world through geologic lens, that it's hard to imagine sea level being 25 feet higher. Not caused by humans even, just part of the ice age cycles. We don't think of that. The ice ages come and go by nature. They've been happening for 2.5 million years, about every 100,000 years. And during the ice ages, sea level goes up and down. We have to look to a new future, and we have to deal with everything mentioned here, from communities of color and equity, as Carl said, and as Scott talked about, the kind of engineering. How do we look at everything from hazardous waste sites and what's in the ground and what happens with saltwater intrusion? And the watershed, as I think you're going to help us think about, Bonnie. But we need to do it realizing the complexity and the multiple time horizons. If we do that, I think we'll do better planning. If we think about where is this headed, our short-term decisions will be better guided, so that we'll be investing in something that won't be overwhelmed by more water to come in the future. Because here's the simple facts. Again, sea level goes up and down with global temperature change because the ice sheets change size. The ice sheets in Greenland and Antarctica. That's where 98% of the potential sea level rise is locked up in ice. They're melting faster and faster because the planet's warmer. And we know from the geologic record that it's an overwhelming equation, that there's about 20 meters of sea level rise for every degree Celsius, or 35 feet for every degree Fahrenheit, to make it really simple. We've already had a degree of warming. The question is, how quickly will the ice on Greenland and Antarctica melt? We're running the experiment now. We're going to find out. We need to slow the warming. We need to be more resilient for the kind of events that are happening today. And we need to begin adapting for what's coming at us. Maybe not in our lifetimes, but certainly our kids and grandkids or nieces and nephews. But we need to think of the world differently. The shoreline is dynamic. We thought sea level was permanent, and we thought that made the shoreline fairly permanent, except for bits of erosion. At king tide events, sunny day flooding events, as I think Scott and maybe Carl mentioned, we're finding extreme flooding these days. Not in our lifetimes, not in our parents' lifetimes, not in our grandparents are we seeing water levels like present. And that's at king tides we see it, but it's driven upward by sea level rise. Now, sea level rise is confusing to conclude this part, but sea level rise is only about 1/4 of an inch a year, 5 millimeters. Seems trivial, but it's like a drip filling the bucket, and the drip's getting faster. And we know from history and what's happening with the ice sheets that this problem is going to get noticeably worse. So we should deal with the problem today and design for it. We should also realize that there are different time frames. And finally, that there are different geographic impacts. I've been to the Bay Area many times, where most of you are from, and that has lots of complexities, from the estuary and the ecosystems and so on, a huge area. But then other parts of the world, like Florida, where I live, are different geography or topography. New Orleans is different, Jakarta is different, Bangladesh, Vietnam. These places all have different topographies, rock structures. Like in South Florida here, we have porous limestone. So you can't build a seawall. The water would just come up under the ground. Can't do what they do in the Netherlands. So we have to look at the geology, the topography, the watersheds, as you say, and think, as I suggest, short, medium, and long term. And I think that gives us a framework, recognizing that sea level is going to be several feet higher, and that it's uncertain how quickly it will happen. Partly that depends on how much we slow the warming. So thanks for the opportunity to contribute. I hope this helps to give a different level of concept to the geography and the timescale.
Well, I look forward to reading your books.
Thank you.
I'm not going to be up on the ladder when I do it, though.
Okay.
So it's very exciting, and thank you for joining us today.
Sure.
I wanted to say a few words about Sophie Maxwell, who's just about landing now and is in customs at San Francisco Airport, International Airport. She, as I mentioned, she's president of the San Francisco PUC and Public Utilities Commission. And that commission is really moving toward blue-green infrastructure. It's very, very exciting to me because I've been pushing them. I do a lot of what I call PP, positive pushing, to get people to think holistically and to think about natural systems and all of the issues that Carl brought up and that Scott brought up. These are really important. And with her leadership and some others on the commission, Ed Harrington is a new commissioner, we're really pushing for this. And when you see my presentation, I'll be talking about some of the opportunities that are possible to move in the direction of a more holistic natural systems approach to redefining managed retreat, as well as many other things like education, et cetera. So with that, I think I'm going to, since Betsy's not here, I'd like to share my presentation with everyone. If I can do that, here we are. Is that going up? Yes. Can you put the images of people on the side, or just me on the side, Ian, please, so we can read it? The title really of our presentation is Redefining Managed Retreat and the Transformational Multi-Benefit Equity-Rich Solutions for Urban Watershed Management. An opportunity and strategy for transforming and addressing multiple systemic issues simultaneously. Why do one thing when we can do 25 things simultaneously? That's an ecological approach to transformation. And the Living Library is a program that I developed beginning in 1981. And it's really a very powerful opportunity to work in many different kinds of environments, from sunken meadows and brownfields to urban sprawl and desolation, public parks and plazas, concrete and asphalt schoolyards, and transform them into vibrant and relevant community environments. I forgot to mention that I am an ecological artist and a landscape architect and planner and an educator. So I put all the things that I love together, and a living library came to be. And the local resources are incorporated in the living library. And we look at these assets through the lens of time, past, present, and future. And what are the local resources of a community? Human, ecological, economic, historic, technological, and aesthetic. So these are very important. No matter where we are, there's incredible richness. We could be in the poorest of poor communities, or in a very wealthy community, an urban place, and rural place. If we look at these assets in a new way, we can discover that we are rich. We are very wealthy as human critters. So a living library is a metaphor. Everyone and everything on earth is part of a living library of diversity. People, birds, trees, air, water, and all the things that we create, such as parks and gardens, and schools and curricula, and artworks and networks and communities. It's a way to understand that culture and technology are part of nature. It's all nature. That's not to say that everything is the same, but it's all part of nature. We are part of nature. And what we do is part of nature. And a living library is also a life frame. Life Frame Inc. is the name of my nonprofit organization. And a life frame literally frames life so we can see it and experience it more profoundly. It's a form of inclusivity. And both a living library and a life frame create sync park. And a sync park is meant to make us think, feel, and be more empathetic about ourselves and each other and all species. So a living library is cultivating both the human and the ecological garden. Happily enough, the initials spell all, so it's a framework for linking biological, cultural, and technological systems. And the idea is, the opportunity is that we learn, when we learn all that we can about our local place, then that we can extrapolate and learn about the world. So even though we're focusing locally, we're also learning globally about the planet. And a living library results in transformed environments and transformed consciousness of people in those environments. That's the goal. And all sectors of the community are involved in processes: research, planning, design, implementation, use, maintenance, management, and communication. So all different parts of the community, from individuals and families, to schools, pre-K, to college, public and private schools and universities, parks and recreation departments, other municipal agencies, state agencies, federal agencies, international agencies, philanthropies, and foundations, corporations, small businesses, chambers of commerce, individuals. So it's not a community group. So it's an opportunity to be inclusive. And what benefits will a living library provide for the community? Well, most importantly, blue-green ecological transformation, addressing climate change, sea level rise, flooding, drought, habitat restoration, retreat, green skills job training, beautification, and many other opportunities, all of which are systemically integrated with hands-on learning by doing for all ages. We really learn by doing. So when we create an exciting place-based, content-rich community master plan, this is on my Excelsior Living Library part of it, that shows 2 high schools, a middle school, and a early education center, where I've been at work doing many transformations with the students since the mid-1990s. And we created a planning program for the young people and the adults. These 2 people up front are in the water department. We all came together over time and learned about what a master plan could be, what the resources were in this community, and how to transform them and use them. This is my student steering committee. And they were very excited about learning about the water, and they got metal detectors donated in order to find the old wells in the community. And we transform the environment and transform consciousness in the environment through integrated learning by doing for all ages. These images show before, during, and after behind James Henry Middle School, which is part of the Excelsior Living Library. And as you can see, these students are hard at work planting 3 kinds of oaks in a redwood circle. These are all redwood stumps, and it becomes a wonderful outdoor classroom. And you can see the bottom left, how this formerly barren, that looks like a prison yard, is transformed into these California native learning zones. That's just one of the transformations that was made on these school district properties over many years. And all subjects come to life through this approach to learning. Hands-on learning by doing, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, all STEAM plus literacy, green skills job training. So it's a very rich way of understanding interconnected systems, biological, cultural, and technological, and it results in transformed places. And of course, we incorporate the local watershed to frame and interconnect neighborhoods and resources, schools, parks, public housing, streets, and other open spaces. I'm going to come back to this slide of the watershed, it's like Creek Watershed, where, by the way, I've been living and working for over 50 years. It's a very powerful watershed, the largest in San Francisco. And we also create new resilient landscapes that address ecological social issues like flooding, climate change, education, green skills, job training. This is a site plan for the Mineral Heights Living Library and Think Park Nature Walk that links multiple schools, parks, public housing, and streets leading to the currently hidden Islas Creek at the south side of one of the parks, St. Mary's Park, soon to be this creek. Now, the big idea of Life Frames Inc. is to develop a network of place-based ecological branch, living library, and think parks locally and globally to be interconnected through multifunctional or multifunctional, as I introduced earlier, sculptural green-powered digital gateway. So this is a planetary genre of opportunity and transformation. This is a sketch of a green-powered digital gateway powered by wind and sun that can bring water forth from the ground as needed, showcase the various digital displays, the multimedia archives that young people have been creating that shows the transformation and resources over time, and also allows for live interactive broadcasts between places. So we can begin to share and understand the commonalities and diversities of different locales, locally and globally. That's a big idea that I think would make a big contribution to the planet. So here's a couple of examples of living library and think parks in diverse locales. Now I mentioned it, framing the Islas Creek watershed, creating all living libraries in community, culture, ecology, technology, opportunities within the transportation corridors, freeway interchanges, public right-of-ways, public housing, parks, schools, streets, and other open spaces. So this is a green vision and opportunity for flood mitigation, plus more triple bottom line opportunities. So the interconnected Islas Creek watershed, communities and gateways to the watershed. Now this is the map, the pink, this is the old San Francisco map, the historic map. The pink is all the fill. By creating new land, when people wanted to expand real estate, they have what I call H8, the human hubris, who thinks that they can control the real estate. So this is probably going to be the first areas that are going to be below water, going to have a problem. This watershed that I'm pointing to is the Islas Creek watershed. It's the largest in San Francisco. It's a very important place. And I'm going to go back to this now. So this L-shaped piece of land in purple is the Excelsior Living Library and Think Park that's been in existence since the 1990s. And this nature walk, this other purple shape, is a prototype watershed opportunity that links the various assets. This could be happening throughout the whole watershed. And the blue circles, the top and the bottom one, show northern, at the top, the northern East Creek Watershed Gateway Community Park, which would fill a completely disgraceful interchange currently. It's adjacent to where I developed an urban farm and art center in the 1970s. And that Northern Gateway Community Park is where we have gardens in the middle of the freeway interchange. And below it is the Southern Gateway Community Park that could transform the Alamany and 101 freeway interchange. It's a very large area, a lot of open space, a lot of dead space currently, and a lot of flooding in the high rain events. And this other circle upstream is at the confluence of where one place currently where the Isles Creek is daylighted, Pentar Canyon, merges with the Cayuga Valley Fork that goes under this area. And there's extreme flooding for all of the houses that are in that place. And what I'm proposing is that we create the Isles Creek Watershed Confluence Community Park. And the idea is that these open spaces and all of the right-of-way can really help us in managing the water from upstream to downstream that Scott spoke about, which is really what we're all speaking about. This is a map from 1896 that shows the two freeway interchanges. This would be the northern freeway interchange and the southern freeway interchange. And you see how there's so much water in this area. And we can be using the water productively on site instead of having it kill us. And we have to start upstream. This is a picture of that same area. This is the northern freeway interchange, and this is the southern freeway interchange. And you see how impacted this area has become. This, by the way, is the Isles Channel, the outflow to the bay of this watershed. Now, what are the values for working this way? What are the benefits, social, cultural, environmental justice? Well, first of all, we can engage all sectors of community from the watershed. And we can collaborate meaningfully with multiple city, state, and federal agencies, and maybe international agencies. We can certainly make the areas safe and accessible where the freeway has severed communities. We can create multiple interactive opportunities for people, including integrated school and community education. And we can provide also very powerful opportunities for green skills job training for maintenance and stewardship of these places. We can also create a sense of place and wonder, which is very important in our communities. And we can create interest at ground level and from freeway views. And we can showcase local resources through multifunctional, sculptural, green-powered digital gateways. And what are the ecological benefits? Well, we can mitigate flooding along freeway corridors, interchanges, and neighborhoods, and reduce polluted runoff into the bay, which is currently happening. And we can combat climate change and sea level rise through ponding, bioswales, peak daylighting, upstream, midstream, downstream. And we can create resilient, native, drought-tolerant, and riparian landscapes, incorporating blue, green, low-impact design within communities using ground and stormwater on site. And of course, we can attract native wildlife to urban areas. And of course, counteract heat island effects. Now, there are multiple funding opportunities that we can attract to do this work. The outreach, planning, design, implementation, ongoing community programs, and maintenance. But we have to work holistically with the agencies, city, state, and federal agencies, as well as private foundations and individual donations. So this is the All My Excelsior Living Library. Here the L is the life, love, learning, life frames, living library, local community, lots of fun and magic. And when I first got to this place, by the way, I was invited by the then principal of the Stocktree Model Middle School, Becoming Creative Living Libraries. He heard about it. And I said, sure, but it was the most depressing place I'd ever been. It looked really horrible. And it was surrounded by acres of asphalt and concrete. But one of the resources that's so powerful in the site, here's the air, and here's the water. The Slayers Creek, this is a map from 1915. And before the schools, this map shows that there were gardens and nurseries. So there's a lot of agriculture already on the site. Wonderful. And here's the L. Here's a map, a Sanborn map from 1907. And here it says the Slayers Creek. So in the mid-90s, in Lake Geneva, in the mid-90s, I thought, oh my God, I'm working in the same watershed as the farm was in, as everything else I've been doing. Not by design, but because the water is so powerful. So that was really amazing. And so I realized that this place is interconnected with all these other places, all these other communities, these 11 communities. Now, Carl mentioned education as being important, and I am a great believer in that, and have been developing all-stream plus literacy programs for K through 12 students, and all Green Futures, Green Skills Job Training, paid internships for middle school, high school, and TAY youth. TAY is transitional age youth, 18 to 24 age. And they learn by doing. And by doing, they help transform the environment. So this, for example, is a current project. You see all the concrete and asphalt. It's concrete, 100% concrete. It's on Seneca Avenue between San Jose and Cayuga. And this place is transformed, is being still transformed. These are high school students from Meeting High School, putting in trees and everything. Look at how beautiful it is. And here they are planting trees, creating basins on the curbside side of the street. So we're creating rain gardens in this area. And it's fantastic, the transformation. And also the knowledge that the young people gain from participating. And it's quite beautiful and colorful. Like the talent palette that I chose, all California native. It's a very colorful variety. So this is upstream. And here I am in China, introducing this work. I've been actually doing presentations all over the world. Last week, I was in the Liverpool Biennial. And earlier, I was in Lisbon, Portugal, with an installation and a presentation. And that's my presentation, and that's our website. So now, I think it's time to go to some questions. I don't think Betsy is joining us, unfortunately. But here's a question from John Englander, and to everybody. What do you consider the worst case scenario for sea level rise this century?
Actually, it's hard to say what the worst case is at this point because of the changes in Antarctica and Greenland, which are happening by the year. But what I advise people is looking at a century is to plan on 5 to 10 feet of sea level rise. I think that's consistent with the California Coastal Commission's last study, which I think was maybe 2 or 3 years ago, looking at an upper limit of about 10 feet.
Okay. Carl asks, what panel framework will ensure that the management process going forward considers the needs of the most disadvantaged in all decisions? I know Carl has a lot to say about that, but does anyone else want to contribute some ideas to this? Well, I would say that the way that we're working in the schools is super important to create consciousness with young people and their families. But Carl, why don't you weigh in on this?
Well, thank you very much, Bonnie. And I'm actually somewhat humbled by the effort that many people have made to find the opportunity to really get our communities acknowledged for what they have been. And, you know, we acknowledge the fact that our native people have lived all over the country in 500 nations, all over the United States, and many territories that have not been ceded. And we've recently become much more conscious of that than we had been previously. The same thing is true of the African American community. Our ancestors were brought over the culture, over the Atlantic Ocean, and forced to work the land for free for 250 years. And then, having done that and having fought in the Civil War for freedom, we've been suppressed, not been able to really get acknowledgement of our human right. Our human right and our environmental rights were stripped from us when our ancestors left from Africa. We have an opportunity now, as we are beginning to plan for the replacement of our reliance on fossil fuels, to build a more egalitarian approach to really addressing the environmental issues of our communities of color. And what that basically means is that every aspect of that ecological awareness needs to really find expression in our communities of color. And we need to find a way to create the numbers of people who need to really be outspoken and participatory on implementing this awareness. I think that we're at a watershed where we have the opportunity now to present the environment not as a white authoritarian society, but as a multiracial, multicultural phenomena in which all of the cultures are really treated with dignity and respect. And I think it means carving out of our budgets and our activity the kind of space that is necessary in order to have full participation of all these communities. We have in the Bay Area, we're dealing with sea level rise. And we still have not had the participation of communities of color in that process, even though those communities are the most vulnerable for flooding and various phenomena that you described, Bonnie. And so I think we need to all kind of dig in and find a way to lift up the efforts of the community groups that have been struggling mostly without resources to have their voices heard and to have their visions realized. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to say this.
Well, what you have to say is super important for everybody to hear. So we appreciate every comment you make. Now, I see that we have some Q&A questions, and here's one for Scott. How are rising seas and saltwater intrusion impacting California water supplies that rely on groundwater?
Thank you, Bonnie, and maybe I can start a quick addressing that question with actually going to Carl, and say first, Carl, I appreciate your words, and I will commit to work with you to bring these issues and the science and the technology and these concepts to the entire diverse community, and the issue of rising seas does affect local communities very much. There is flooding, there's dry land flooding in Oakland and some of the lower lying areas that is bringing in saline water, salt water, et cetera, not just to water supply, but to the land itself. And that's part of the issues of how we're constructed. With regards to water supply in California overall, from the question that was asked, this is not a new issue. It's an issue that's been going on for years. Salt water is more dense than fresh water. It tends to form a wedge underneath the land shore and aquifers, and so you see communities and districts up and down the state of California who have been trying to address this for decades. They do it by pumping. When you pump water out, you bring more salt water in. And so there's been reverse pumping, essentially creating a hydraulic barrier to keep the salt water out. But those are indirect issues that we're trying to essentially fight against, if you will, right? So there's the direct issues of salt water coming in on its own. There's the indirect issues of the engineering remedies, which cost dollars, and infrastructure and all kinds of things that you have to deal with, which then go out. We do have better tools to understand where those saltwater wedges are, but it's also a matter of then being more conservation aware from the standpoint of how much water are we using, how much water are we pumping. So it is an issue. And I should mention that it's not just an issue on the shores, but the saline issues are also an impact in the inland areas too. California has a lot of groundwater reserves. Many of those groundwater reserves are really deep, and that deeper water is much more salty. And when we're in a drought situation like we are right now, and we have less recharge, less supplied water coming in, that means you have more pumping of that deep water, which creates more salt water, which comes out on the land surface and creates a problem for growing crops, for example, because you have too much salt. So I think this is the watershed issue again, right? And it's that hydrologic matter that's, again, it's a full-on cycle, and our assessment needs to expand greatly.
You know, Congressman Huffman said a few things about this in his remarks in the video he created for us. And really what we're talking about is brackish water and what vegetation grows in the brackish water. But he mentioned the mangroves, which actually do grow, and they help protect the coastline. It's an ecological solution. In Thailand, when they took away the mangroves, they were devastated by flooding some years back in Phuket, you may remember. And that was because they took away the mangroves. That was part of their result. So we have to pay attention to the vegetation that can be used to help counteract and utilize the brackish water results at the shoreline. That's just one thing. He said other thing. That's just one.
Yeah. And Bonnie, if I can follow very quickly, that's actually a great example on some of these contaminated land issues around the shoreline, because it's called phytoremediation. It's essentially trees pump water and vegetation controls water. And by matching the future of what kind of salt-tolerant vegetation, whether that's getting our saltgrass back, mangroves, et cetera, that can work in the climate, yes, that is an effective tool to look at in certain cases.
So we have to be very mindful of a holistic series of opportunities and not just be a linear concrete, not building just concrete tunnels or concrete walls, levees. We have to think upstream, midstream, downstream. Now somebody's asked me a question. How can I build all a living library for senior communities? It's a great question. And it is a very doable process. And I would ask that whoever sent that to me get in touch with me directly, a little advertisement, Bonnie Ora, BONNIEORA, at alivинglibrary.org. Don't forget the A or you'll be in Denmark, which is a nice place to be, but you won't contact me. Or info@alivинglibrary.org. And there are ways to do this, for sure. And it's all place-based and situation-based. So wherever you're thinking about doing this, we can come up with some good opportunities. Now here's another question for the panel, and it's been lightly addressed. What is our best approach to funding these restoration projects, whether on the shore or in upland areas? Anybody want to weigh in on that? Anybody have some thoughts?
Well, I'll just bring up real quickly, lots of different examples, and it's complex, and we know that. Fortunately, in the Bay Area at least, we did have a tax measure, where we taxed ourselves a few years ago, Measure AA, which did provide some funding for doing restoration projects, and all 9 counties had to vote on this, and essentially it's a parcel tax on ourselves. That is just one measure, of course, but I think what it shows is that when there is a will by the public, there are ways to get some things done. And I know that is one example of many that we have to be creative about, right, in bringing funding, and then having designs and approaches that actually are going to succeed, so that we can demonstrate success, which will then allow that flywheel to spin faster for additional funding.
Exactly. We have to be compelling in our vision. And in the work that I've been doing, I've gotten funding from the state and the local governments, and I think there's a lot of money for watershed rejuvenation, urban watershed rejuvenation, and certainly for education, and certainly for job training. So you have to look in different places, not just one source of funding, but you do have to be very creative. But there's a lot of money out there. We just have to find it and be compelling and go after it and get it and use it and spend it and do wonderful things. And we're just at, I think, our end point. Any final words from anybody? Carl, do you want to say a final word quickly?
Pardon me? I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Well, we have very little time. A final word, final thought for the group.
Well, we've been around here, I've been around here 82 years. That makes me an old man. But, we as a people have been here for several hundred years, and the indigenous people have been here for thousands and thousands of years. And it's about time that we begin to really appreciate the wisdom that the indigenous people have. We are beginning to understand it, but it's taking a long time, and we have to undo the damage. Speaking of retreating, we have to think about how much we indigenous people have retreated from the Trail of Tears to the present day. We need to really restore the magnificence of those cultures and be able to put our own contribution alongside of them, saying that we do this together. Thanks. So thank you very much.
That's bravo. I'm totally in agreement. Last word, John.
Since we're over time, I won't do a message. If anybody wants more about my stuff, it's johnenglander.net is my website. And my new book, Moving to Higher Ground. I'll just leave it with that.
Any final word?
Well, first, thank you, Bonnie, for putting this together, and then take Carl's words to heart, right? Which means listen to the landscape and act accordingly.
I agree.
Good message.
Well, I want to thank everyone for being here. We had a few ups and downs in terms of people actually attending, but I think we all did a good job in communicating important issues, and I'm very grateful that that we're all here, and thank you to everybody.
Thank you.
Beautiful, and it's very interesting, the work that we're all doing. And when we work together, all of us, I think we can create something totally profound and inspirational and transformational. and solve these issues as we're faced by them. So thank you, everybody, and I have no idea who's out there, but thank you for being here, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as we did. Au revoir.